The studio clock showed 6:47 p.m. 3 hours and 47 minutes since they'd started. Dieter Bohlen sat at the mixing board with his head in his hands. Thomas Anders stood in the vocal booth, headphones around his neck, staring at the floor. Between them, through the soundproof glass, hung the worst recording either man had ever been part of. Not just bad. Catastrophically bad. The kind of bad that made you question whether you understood music at all. The synthesizer track that Dieter had been so confident about sounded cheap, dated, like a poor imitation of better producers. Thomas's vocals, usually so smooth and controlled, were strained, disconnected, like he was singing someone else's song in someone else's style. There was no chemistry, no magic, no hint of the phenomenon they would become. Just two talented people who, for reasons neither could understand, produced something terrible when put together. Dieter pressed the intercom button. "Let's take a break." His voice was flat, defeated. Thomas nodded, didn't say anything, just walked out of the booth. They'd both been so certain this would work, that the combination of Dieter's production genius and Thomas's voice would create something special. Instead, they'd created something that shouldn't be released under any circumstances. This was February 1984. This was supposed to be the beginning of modern talking. Instead, it felt like the end before they'd even started. Before understanding why that first session failed so spectacularly, you need to understand how Dieter Bohlen and Thomas Anders had ended up in that Hamburg studio together. They hadn't grown up together, hadn't been friends, hadn't even known each other existed until a few months earlier. Dieter was 29, already a working producer with some minor successes. He'd written songs for other artists, had a good reputation in the German music industry, but he hadn't broken through to the level he wanted, hadn't created the massive hit that would establish him as a major force. He was good, respected, but not yet great. Thomas was 21. Born Bernd Weidung, he'd recently changed his name for stage purposes. He'd been working small venues, building his voice, developing his craft. He had talent, obvious talent, a vocal range and tone that producers noticed. But he hadn't found the right project, the right sound, the right partner to showcase what he could do. They'd been introduced by a mutual contact in the industry, someone who thought Dieter's production style might complement Thomas's voice. The meeting had been casual, professional, both men sizing each other up. Dieter had played Thomas some of his recent work. Electronic, pop, day, synthesizer heavy, influenced by what was coming out of America and Britain, but with a distinctly European sensibility. Thomas had listened carefully, then said he was interested. Dieter had asked Thomas to sing something, anything. Thomas had performed a cover. Dieter had listened with increasing attention. The voice was good. Very good. Not just technically proficient, but emotionally expressive. The kind of voice that could carry a song beyond its production. They'd talked for another hour. About music. About what they wanted to create. About whether they could work together. Both had felt cautiously optimistic. Not excited exactly, but hopeful. By the end of that first meeting, they'd agreed to try recording together. See if the combination of Dieter's production and Thomas's vocals could create something worth pursuing. Dieter had gone home and immediately started writing. He'd been working on a song idea for months. Hadn't found the right approach, but listening to Thomas's voice had sparked something. I were ride down to tower named at wake. We the light I show and did. He'd stayed up all night refining it. By morning, he had the demo. Synthesizer melody, driving beat, romantic lyrics. He'd called it "You're My Heart, You're My Soul." It was perfect. He was certain. This was the song that would prove the collaboration could work. When Thomas had come to the studio for their first recording session, Dieter had been confident, almost cocky. He'd played the demo. Thomas had listened, nodded appreciatively, said he liked it. They'd spent the first hour going over the arrangement. discussing the vocal approach, making sure Thomas understood the vision. Everything had seemed fine, professional, promising. Then they'd started recording, and immediately everything fell apart. The first problem was technical. The key Dieter had written the song and worked for the demo, but not for Thomas's voice. Too high in some sections, too low in others. Thomas kept straining to hit notes that should have been easy for someone with his range. They'd tried adjusting, transposing. Nothing felt right. The second problem was more fundamental. Thomas couldn't connect with the lyrics. He was singing the words correctly, hitting the notes, following the melody, but there was no emotion behind it. No conviction. It sounded like he was reading a phone book set to music. Dieter had tried coaching him. More feeling, more passion. Like you mean it. Thomas had tried, really tried, but the more he pushed for emotion, the more forced it sounded. By hour 2, both men were frustrated. Dieter kept making adjustments to the production. Thomas kept trying different vocal approaches. Nothing worked. The song that had sounded so promising as a demo was dying in the actual recording. By hour 3, they were barely communicating. Dieter would make a suggestion. Thomas would try it. It wouldn't work. They'd move on to the next attempt. A pattern of failure repeating itself. The energy in the studio had gone from professional optimism to tense frustration to quiet despair. When they finally stopped at 6:47 p.m., both men knew they'd failed. Not just failed to record a good song, failed to prove the collaboration could work. The chemistry they'd hoped for didn't exist. Thomas took off his headphones and walked out of the vocal booth without a word. Dieter sat at the mixing board, staring at the waveforms on the screen. 3 hours and 47 minutes of audio that was completely unusable. He played back a section, listened critically. It was worse than he'd thought. The production sounded mechanical, lifeless. The vocals sounded disconnected, like Thomas was singing in a different studio, in a different city, for a different song. There was no cohesion, no unity, no sense that these two elements belonged together. Dieter had produced dozens of sessions. Some had been challenging. Some had required multiple takes. But he'd never experienced this. Complete incompatibility between artist and production. Thomas stood in the control room, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Dieter said what they were both thinking. "This isn't working." Thomas nodded. "I know. I don't understand why. The demo sounded good. Your voice is good. But together it's wrong," Thomas finished. "Yeah, it feels wrong." Dieter rubbed his face. Exhausted. Frustrated. Maybe we're not compatible. Maybe this collaboration was a bad idea. Thomas considered this. Maybe. Another long silence. Dieter started shutting down equipment. The universal signal that the session was over. Thomas picked up his jacket, started putting it on. Both men were resigned to the failure, ready to go home and try to figure out what went wrong and whether there was any point in trying again. But as Thomas was putting on his jacket, Dieter had a thought. Not a fully formed idea, just an impulse. "Wait," he said. Thomas paused. "What if we're approaching this wrong?" "What do you mean?" "Everything we did today was planned, structured. I gave you specific directions. You followed them. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe we're trying too hard to control it." Thomas looked skeptical. "So what do you suggest?" Dieter thought for a moment. "One more take. But this time, no direction from me. No specific instructions. Just sing it however feels natural. Don't think about what I want. Don't try to match the demo. Just respond to the music and see what happens. That's the opposite of everything we've been doing. I know. But what we've been doing clearly doesn't work. So let's try something completely different. If it fails, we're no worse off than we are now. But maybe if we stop trying to force it, something will happen naturally." Thomas considered this. He was tired, discouraged, ready to leave. But something about Dieter's proposal made him pause. Maybe Because it required less effort, less pressure, less performance. Or maybe because he sensed the same thing Dieter sensed, that they'd been approaching this wrong. That the problem wasn't the song or the vocals or the production. The problem was trying too hard to make something that needed to happen organically. Okay, Thomas said. One more take. But if it doesn't work, we're done. I'm not spending another 3 hours on something that's clearly not meant to be. Agreed. Thomas walked back into the vocal booth. Put the headphones on. Dieter reset the track to the beginning. But before starting playback, he made a decision. He'd adjust the key. Not to what worked theoretically, to what his instinct said might work better. 2 steps down from the original. He pressed play. The synthesizer intro started. Different now. Lower, darker. More space in the arrangement. Thomas closed his eyes. Listened. Didn't try to prepare. Didn't think about technique or performance or what Dieter wanted. Just listened. When his cue came, he started singing. And immediately, something was different. The strain was gone. He wasn't reaching for notes. He was landing on them naturally. The words that had felt foreign 3 hours ago suddenly felt personal, like he'd written them himself. He wasn't performing the song. He was living inside it. Dieter sat at the mixing board, barely breathing, listening. Wow. This was different. The vocal wasn't what he'd imagined. It was better, more nuanced, more emotional. Thomas was finding inflections and dynamics that Dieter hadn't written, but that made perfect sense. The production that had sounded mechanical suddenly had life, because the vocal was giving it context, making it human, creating the emotional center it had been missing. Thomas opened his eyes halfway through the first verse, made eye contact with Dieter through the glass. Something passed between them. Recognition. They both felt it. This was working. Not just working. This was what they'd hoped for. The chemistry they'd failed to find for 3 hours had suddenly appeared. Dieter started making subtle adjustments to the mix as Thomas sang high, bringing up certain frequencies, pulling back others, responding to what Thomas was giving him rather than trying to impose a predetermined vision. It became a conversation. Thomas would phrase something a certain way. Dieter would adjust the production to support that choice. Dieter would emphasize a certain beat. Thomas would respond rhythmically, back and forth, give and take, creating something neither had planned but both recognized as right. When Thomas hit the chorus, "You're my heart, you're my soul," it wasn't the powerful declaration Dieter had imagined. It was more vulnerable, more intimate, like a confession rather than a proclamation. And it was perfect. More perfect than anything Dieter had originally envisioned. Because it was real. It was Thomas connecting with the emotion rather than performing an idea of emotion. The song lasted 3 minutes and 48 seconds. When it ended, Thomas took off his headphones slowly, looked at Dieter. Dieter sat motionless at the board. Then he pressed the intercom. That was it. Thomas nodded. Yeah. That was it. They'd found it. The thing they'd been searching for all day. The chemistry that makes a collaboration more than the sum of its parts. It had been there all along. They'd just been trying so hard to find it that they'd prevented it from emerging naturally. Dieter played the take back. Both men listened critically. It wasn't perfect. There were moments that could be tightened. Small technical issues. But the core was there. The magic was there. The thing that couldn't be manufactured or forced or planned. It had happened organically when they'd stopped trying to control it. "We should do another take," Thomas said. "Clean up some of those rough spots." "No," Dieter said. "This is the one. If we try to perfect it, we'll lose what makes it work. The imperfections are part of why it feels real." Thomas considered this, nodded. "You're right." They spent another hour refining the mix, making small adjustments, but the core vocal performance remained untouched. That single take, 4 minutes, the take they'd almost never recorded because they'd been ready to give up. By 8:15 p.m., they had it. The final mix of You're My Heart, You're My Soul. Dieter burned a reference, C. Diet. They listened to it one more time, then sat in silence. This is going to work, Dieter said finally. The collaboration. Us. This is the beginning of something. Thomas smiled, tired but genuinely happy. Yeah, I think it is. They shook hands, made plans to meet again the following week to start work on the next song. Thomas left. Dieter stayed in the studio for another 2 hours, playing the song, analyzing it, trying to understand what had changed, what had made that final take work when everything before had failed. He realized several things. First, the key change had been crucial, but not because of technical vocal range, because it had shifted the emotional space of the song, made it darker, more intimate, more aligned with Thomas's natural expression. Second, removing all his specific direction had freed Thomas to find his own interpretation. Dieter's vision for the song had been good, but Thomas's instinctive response to the music had been better. By letting go of control, Dieter had gotten something more valuable than what he'd planned. Third, and most important, the chemistry had always been there. They'd just been blocking it with overthinking and overproduction. The moment they'd relaxed, stopped trying, let it happen, the chemistry had emerged naturally. That lesson would define their entire partnership. Modern Talking worked best when Dieter provided structure and Thomas brought instinct, when production and performance met in the middle rather than one dominating the other. The 3 hours and 47 minutes of failure had been necessary. Not wasted time. Necessary education about how they worked together and how they didn't. About what happened when they forced versus what happened when they allowed. You're My Heart, You're My Soul was released as a single in October 1984. It went to #1 in Germany, then Austria, then Switzerland, then across Europe. It became one of the defining pop songs of the 1980s. The foundation of Modern Talking's entire career. Millions of people heard it, danced to it, made it the soundtrack to their lives, but almost no one knew how close it came to never existing. How close Dieter and Thomas came to giving up after that first disastrous recording session. How they'd spent 3 hours and 47 minutes proving they couldn't work together before spending 4 minutes proving they could. Over the years, both men would talk about that day. Usually in interviews when asked about the beginning of Modern Talking, how they'd found each other, how they'd known it would work, and they'd tell a simplified version about meeting, about the first recording session, about the instant chemistry. What they usually didn't mention was the first 3 hours and 47 minutes. The frustration, the moment when both had been ready to walk away. That part didn't fit the narrative, didn't support the myth of instant success and natural partnership. But the truth was more interesting, more human, more instructive. The truth was that every great collaboration has a moment when it almost doesn't happen. When the people involved are so focused on what they think it should be, that they can't see what it actually is. When effort and control prevent the natural chemistry from emerging. Modern Talking had that moment, and they almost didn't survive it. The thing that saved them was humility. Dieter's willingness to admit his approach wasn't working and try something different. Thomas's willingness to stay for one more attempt despite being ready to leave. And both men's ability to recognize when something was working and protect it rather than trying to improve it to death. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They'd spent years after that first session building Modern Talking into a massive commercial success. Dozens of songs, multiple albums, millions of records sold. But in many ways, they never captured that exact magic again. That specific chemistry of the first take of You're My Heart, You're My Soul. Because that take had been unconscious, unplanned, the product of exhaustion and surrender rather than calculation and control. Every subsequent song was good, often very good, but they were products of a refined system, a proven formula. They knew what worked, how to create it, how to replicate it. That first song had been different. It had been discovery, not knowing what would work and stumbling into it by accident. That's the thing about chemistry. You can't manufacture it. You can create conditions that allow it to happen. You can recognize it when it appears, but you can't force it. And sometimes the best thing you can do is get out of its way. Dieter Bohlen learned that lesson on February 14th, 1984, between 6:47 p.m. and 7:15 p.m. 28 minutes that changed everything. 28 minutes that almost never happened because the 3 hours and 47 minutes before them had been such a spectacular failure. When Modern Talking broke up in 1987, part of the reason was that they'd lost sight of that lesson, had started trying to control and perfect and manufacture rather than allowing and responding and discovering, had forgotten that their best work came from instinct rather than calculation. When they reunited in 1998, one of the first things they did was listen to the original recording of You're My Heart, You're My Soul, the one from that first session. Both men were struck by how raw it was, how unpolished, how much more alive it sounded compared to their later, more refined work. We should try to capture this again, Thomas had said. I don't know if we can, Dieter had responded. We were different people then. We didn't know what we were doing. That was the advantage. So we pretend we don't know what we're doing? Maybe. Or maybe we just remember that the best stuff happens when we stop trying so hard. They tried. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they didn't. But they never forgot that first day. The disaster that became discovery. The failure that became foundation. The moment they almost gave up that became the moment everything began. Modern Talking's legacy is complicated. Commercial success and artistic compromise, brilliant production and formulaic songwriting, innovation and repetition. But at the core of everything they created was that first session. 3 hours and 47 minutes of getting it completely wrong, followed by 4 minutes of getting it perfectly right. The story of how Modern Talking almost never existed. How close we came to never hearing You're My Heart, You're My Soul. How two talented people almost missed their chance to create something together that neither could have created alone. All because they were trying too hard. All because they hadn't yet learned that chemistry can't be forced, only discovered. And sometimes discovery requires failing first. Failing completely. Failing so thoroughly that you're ready to give up. And then trying one more time, not because you think it will work, but because you've already failed so completely that one more failure won't matter. That's when magic happens. When you've exhausted all the ways it's supposed to work and accidentally stumble into the one way it actually does. Modern Talking was born in those 28 minutes, but it was made possible by the 3 hours and 47 minutes of failure that came before. Both mattered. The disaster and the discovery. The ending that almost was and the beginning that almost wasn't. That's the real story of the first Modern Talking recording session. Ji Sao. Not the myth. The messy human, nearly abandoned truth.